Deadwood was the kind of town that looked half-built and half-burned, like God himself had started it and then changed his mind. Smoke crawled from crooked chimneys, muddy streets swallowed wagon wheels whole, and every saloon door sounded like a coffin lid when it swung shut. Men came to Deadwood to get rich, to disappear, or to die trying. By sundown, the town belonged to fear, and fear had a name whispered low in gambling halls and stable yards alike: the Black Vultures. They were not lawmen, not outlaws in the ordinary sense, but something fouler in between. They rode armed through camp and town as if every soul in the Dakota dust owed them blood. Their leader, Gideon Crow, had built his rule on three things: cruelty, gold, and spectacle. He liked an audience when men begged. He liked witnesses that evening when women cried. The whole of Deadwood heard the scream before they saw the riders. 3 horses came thundering through the main strip, their iron shoes cutting sparks off stone, and across the saddle of the lead rider was a young woman bound at the wrists, her dark hair dragging in the wind like a torn flag. Her name was Clara Whitmore, daughter of a schoolteacher killed the winter before, and one of the few people in town still foolish enough to speak against Crow's gang. She had told a church gathering that evil survives not because it is strong, but because decent men go silent. Now the Black Vultures were answering her sermon in the only language they knew. They hauled her down in front of the Granger saloon and tied her to a hitching post as townsfolk pretended not to look. Crow stepped from his saddle in a black coat dusty at the hem and smiled the slow smile of a man who enjoyed stretching terror out like a meal. "Tonight," he announced, "Deadwood learns what happens to those who forget who owns the dark." Not one deputy stirred. Not one miner set down his drink. Even the piano inside the saloon stopped mid-note. Clara lifted her bruised face and spat blood at Crow's boots. That made him laugh. Then, from the far end of the street, where twilight laid a long strip of shadow between the bathhouse and the feed store, someone began walking toward them. At first, he seemed hardly more than a shape cut from dusk. Long coat, hat brim low, boots moving with the calm of a man who had never once hurried toward violence, because violence always found him first. He wore no badge, no colors, no sign of allegiance. Only a revolver hung at one hip and an old rifle rested in the crook of his arm. Some said later that they recognized him from Cheyenne. Others swore he had passed through Abilene under another name, but in that moment he belonged to no story Deadwood knew. He stopped 10 paces from Clara and the Black Vultures, and when he raised his head, the last of the sunlight caught a scar running pale across his jaw. His eyes were not angry. That was the unsettling part. They were steady, tired, and cold in the way winter rivers are cold. Nothing personal about it, but fatal all the same. Crow looked him over and grinned for the benefit of the crowd. "You lost, stranger?" The man's voice came low and even, carrying farther than a shout in the dead quiet street. "Release her." A few people on the boardwalk sucked in their breath. One gambler muttered a prayer. Crow's grin widened because he loved nothing more than a challenge he believed he could crush. Around him, his men chuckled and adjusted their gun belts. One of them, a thick-necked brute called Morrow Pike, stepped forward, twirling a knife between his fingers. "You deaf, drifter? This ain't your concern." The stranger's gaze did not leave Crow. "You got 3 breaths." That made the laughter louder, uglier. Crow spread his arms to the town as if unveiling a stage act. "Hear that? Deadwood's got itself a hero." Then he drove the heel of his boot into Clara's side, and she gasped against the post. The stranger did not flinch. He just shifted slightly, enough for the leather of his coat to lift from the butt of his revolver. First breath. The whole town seemed to breathe with him. Second breath. Pike sneered and lunged, knife flashing. Nobody in Deadwood ever agreed on whether the stranger fully drew first, or if the gun was simply suddenly in his hand like judgment made visible. But the shot cracked through the evening, and Pike spun backward into the mud with a hole in his chest. Before the body even landed, 2 more vultures reached for iron. The stranger moved once, maybe twice, and both men collapsed beside the water trough in a burst of splinters and blood. Clara stared in disbelief. The crowd stumbled back into doorways. Crow's grin finally vanished. Then the nameless gunslinger spoke again, calmer than before. "Third breath's gone." What followed was not a gunfight so much as an execution of arrogance. Crow's remaining men spread out across the street, trying to circle, but the stranger seemed to know where each one would step before his boot touched dirt. A man fired from beside the barber pole and was dropped through the saloon window. Another leaned from a rooftop with a shotgun and lost his weapon to a rifle round so precise it looked like magic. Horses screamed, women ducked behind wagons, and the air turned thick with powder smoke. Yet, through all of it, the stranger kept moving toward Clara, never rushing, never wasting motion, as if the whole storm of lead around him were only weather he had already lived through. Crow backed toward the hitching rail, his confidence draining into hatred. "Who are you?" he snarled. The stranger holstered one revolver and cut Clara's ropes with a bowie knife drawn from behind his belt. "Nobody you'll remember long." Clara stumbled, but he caught her by the arm just long enough to steady her, then put himself between her and Crow. By now the street was littered with groaning men and rising dust. Only Crow and two of his hardest killers remained standing. One rushed in from the left with a repeater and took a bullet through the throat. The other charged from behind a wagon with a hatchet, only for the stranger to slam the rifle stock into his face so hard teeth sprayed across the mud. Crow fired twice in panic, both shots going wild as Clara dropped behind a trough. The stranger returned one shot that shattered Crow's pistol and tore 2 fingers from his hand. The outlaw chief fell to one knee, clutching the ruin and shrieking curses that sounded almost childlike under the pain. For the first time in years, Deadwood saw Gideon Crow begging something, not for mercy, but for understanding, as though he could not believe the world had finally sent a man he could not frighten. "Take the gold," Crow hissed. "Take the horses, take the town, just walk away." The stranger looked down at him without triumph. "Town was yours because they were afraid," he said. "That ends tonight." Then hoofbeats echoed from the northern road. More vultures were coming, drawn by the gunfire. Clara, trembling and bruised, grabbed the stranger's sleeve. "There's too many." He turned toward the rising dust cloud, his face unreadable beneath the brim. "Then Deadwood's about to choose," he said, thumbing fresh cartridges into his revolver, "whether it stays a graveyard with buildings or becomes a town again." The riders came in hard from the north trail, 6 of them at first and more behind. Dark shapes under the moonrise with rifles bouncing in their hands. News traveled fast in outlaw circles. Pride traveled faster. The black vultures had ruled by making examples of men, and now one nameless stranger had turned their warning into a humiliation. They could not let that stand. Crow, bleeding in the mud, screamed at his men to kill everything that moved. Windows shattered as shots tore into storefronts. People who had hidden through the first gunfight now crawled under wagons or pressed themselves flat inside the church and the general store. Deadwood was once again on the edge of surrendering its soul. Clara crouched behind the trough, breath shaking, while the stranger dragged an overturned wagon into the middle of the street for cover. He moved like someone who had built barricades before, in other doomed places with other frightened faces. "Can you shoot?" he asked her. She swallowed and nodded. "My father taught me." He handed her a fallen revolver, checked the cylinder, and pointed toward the balcony of the hotel. "Get up there. Stay low. Only fire when you see their eyes." There was no flourish in him, no attempt to comfort with lies. It made Clara trust him more than kindness would have. As she ran, crouched and fast, a bullet clipped the sign above her and showered splinters over her shoulders. The stranger stepped into the open and answered with a rifle shot that knocked a rider clean from his saddle before the horse even hit full stride. Then came the moment Deadwood would remember long after names faded. Old Ben Ralston, the blacksmith with hands like anvils, emerged from his forge carrying a double-barrel shotgun. He took one look at the stranger standing alone in the street and muttered, "Ain't right one man fights for all of us." Then he fired both barrels into the nearest vulture and roared for more shells. Something changed. A miner passed him ammunition, The hotel keeper shoved a rifle through an upstairs window. The church widow who rang the Sunday bell began ringing it now like a war alarm. Fear did not vanish, but shame finally outweighed it. Deadwood, battered and late, was beginning to stand. The battle spread across the whole main strip under lantern light and moon shadow. Clara reached the hotel balcony, flattened herself behind a post, and found her hands steadier than her thoughts. Below, the nameless gunslinger fought like a man with no expectation of surviving, which made him terrible to face. He slid from horse trough to porch post, from wagon wheel to water barrel, always cutting down the most dangerous shooter first. Men tried flanking him through alleys, but Ben Ralston and two miners stopped them with blasts of buckshot and pick handles. The bell kept ringing, wild and urgent, while smoke rolled low across the muddy street. Clara saw one rider aim for the stranger's back and pulled the trigger before she had time to think. The man pitched sideways from his saddle. Her arms jolted from the recoil, but when she looked down, the stranger glanced up just once and gave the smallest nod. It meant more than a speech. Crow, meanwhile, had dragged himself into the doorway of the Granger saloon and wrapped his ruined hand in a torn curtain. Hatred kept him upright. He seized a rifle and began shouting promises: money, whiskey, women, whatever it took to drive his men harder. Then he saw Clara on the balcony and smiled through his blood. He slipped around the side of the saloon, using the chaos as cover. The stranger noticed too late. He broke from his position and ran through open gunfire toward the hotel as Crow climbed the back stairs like a wounded spider. By the time Clara turned, Crow was already on the balcony, grabbing her by the hair and jamming the rifle barrel beneath her chin. "Drop it!" he bellowed to the street below. Everything froze for one dangerous second. The bell stopped. Ben lowered his shotgun. Even the horses seemed to still. Crow's chest heaved as he looked down at the stranger. "You should have ridden on," he spat. "Men like you always think they can outrun what they've done." That was the first crack in the mystery. Clara felt it too. The outlaw knew him, really knew him. The gunslinger stood in the street, revolver lowered but not dropped, eyes fixed on Crow with something deeper than anger now. Old history, old graves. "Let her go, Gideon." Crow barked a laugh. "Say your name first. Let them hear it. Let them know who came dragging death into town." The stranger said nothing. Moonlight caught the scar on his jaw and made him look like a ghost refusing resurrection. Crow leaned closer to Clara and whispered loudly enough for the street below to hear. "This man ain't no drifter. He's Eli Mercer, the butcher of Bitter Creek." The name hit the street like another volley. Some had heard it in fragments, in campfire rumors and prisoner talk. A gunman who once rode with a vigilante band that became no better than the men they hunted. A survivor of a massacre at Bitter Creek, where 30 men died in one night, and the truth was buried beneath official lies. Clara stared at the stranger, now Eli Mercer, and for the first time saw the weight he carried not as mystery, but as punishment. Crow grinned, tasting victory and revelation. "Tell them," he shouted. "Tell them how many widows your justice made." Eli finally spoke, and his voice was rougher than before, as if dragged over years of stone. "Everything you heard about Bitter Creek is true enough to shame me and false enough to flatter you." Crow's smile twitched. Eli stepped forward once. "You were there. You started it. You burned the houses and wore another man's badge while children screamed inside." The town listened, breath held. Crow's face curdled. In that instant, Clara understood. This was never random. Eli had not wandered into Deadwood by accident. He had been following the trail of the men who turned him into a legend built from blood and lies, and Gideon Crow was the last of them. Crow snarled and jerked Clara tighter, but his shaking hand betrayed him. He wanted control, yet fear had already eaten it from within. Eli lowered his gun completely and took another step. "I don't want absolution," he said. "I came for one thing only, to make sure evil dies by its own name." Crow fired. Clara twisted at the same instant, throwing off the shot just enough for the bullet to rip through her shoulder instead of her throat. Eli's revolver thundered once, Crow staggered back, eyes wide, and hit the balcony rail. For a heartbeat he stayed there, all his power gone, moonlight washing the blood across his shirt like black paint. Then the rail cracked, and he fell into the street below. Silence swallowed Deadwood. The surviving vultures threw down their guns or fled into the hills. Ben Ralston was the first to move, followed by others, stepping out from hiding places like men waking from a long sickness. Eli ran upstairs, catching Clara before she collapsed fully. He pressed a handkerchief to her wound while she fought to stay conscious. "You came back for him," she whispered. Eli looked toward the broken street where Crow lay still. "No," he said after a long moment. "I came back for the part of me he left alive." By dawn, the dead were buried, the wounded bandaged, and Deadwood looked different, though every building stood where it had the day before. Fear no longer owned the silence. When the first light touched the hills, Eli Mercer saddled his horse without ceremony. Clara, pale but standing, met him at the edge of town. "You could stay," she said. He gave the faintest ghost of a smile. "Towns need school teachers more than gunmen." She answered, "Then maybe come back when it needs neither." He tipped his hat, turned his horse toward the open country, and rode into the gold-colored morning with no one cheering and no one stopping him. But behind him, in the muddy street of a town that had finally found its spine, people would tell the story for years of the night. A nameless gunslinger faced the most notorious thugs in Deadwood and said 4 words that changed everything. "Release her. Right now."